days, one didn't see it very often, and I saw Mick Jagger on the stage, and God, I mean, it did me in.
When you think of raw, explosive, unapologetic honesty in rock music, you think of Pete Townshend? At 80 years old, his words carry more than just memories. They carry the weight of a man who has seen it all, built it all, and wasn't afraid to tear it all down when it didn't meet his vision. He wasn't just the guitarist of The Who, he was the mind behind the mayhem, the architect of rock opera, the man who turned rebellion into an art form. And when Townshend speaks, even decades later, the rock world listens loudly because Pete didn't just break guitars, he broke illusions. He called out what he saw as hypocrisy, mediocrity, and betrayal within the very industry he helped define. So, when he opened up about the 6 bands that he absolutely could not stand, bands he believed were poison to rock's rebellious core, it wasn't gossip, it was judgment, from a man who helped build the temple, tearing down the idols who, in his eyes, defiled it. Townshend never hated for the sake of it. His criticisms weren't driven by ego or envy. They were born out of a deep love, an almost spiritual commitment to what rock and roll was supposed to mean. So when he pointed his sharp tongue toward fellow musicians, he wasn't picking fights. He was defending something sacred. It all starts with a band that many consider royalty in the progressive rock universe. Yes, to their fans, Yes was a revelation, complex arrangements, spellbinding instrumentation, lyrics that tried to brush against the metaphysical, but to Townshend, they were everything wrong with where rock was heading. He allegedly saw their 20-minute epics and virtuosic solos not as brilliance, but as vanity, what he once referred to quite savagely as musical masturbation. To him, Yes was rock abandoning its roots. It was rock deciding it wanted to beat classical music, and in doing so, turning its back on the very kids who gave it life, working-class kids, angry kids, broken kids who didn't have music degrees or high-end record players, just rage and hope and hunger for something real. Townshend felt that Yes had traded all that for self-indulgent complexity. In his mind, rock wasn't meant to be a puzzle, it was meant to be a punch to the gut. And the more popular Yes became, the more furious he grew. Not because they were stealing the spotlight, but because he feared they were leading a generation of musicians down a dead-end road, one where rock became inaccessible, academic, and emotionally hollow. He supposedly mocked their songs for being so long and layered they needed an intermission, asking, "How is that still rock and roll? Where's the fire? Where's the fight?" And then came Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. To some, Elp were gods of theatrical rock. To Townshend, they were clowns with expensive instruments. He reportedly loathed their obsession with classical reinterpretations and over-the-top stage antics. Keith Emerson's multi-keyboard performances, complete with spinning pianos and moogs stacked like altars, didn't impress him, they infuriated him. He saw it all as smoke and mirrors, spectacle without substance. Townshend believed that Elp, like Yes, had twisted rock into something elitist, a grand performance for the privileged, detached from the raw emotional core of the genre. He saw their use of orchestras and operatic themes not as innovation, but as a betrayal. To him, rock wasn't about sophistication, it was about soul. And Elp, in his view, had none of it. He allegedly went as far as to schedule the Who's concerts to clash with theirs as a deliberate protest. He wanted to remind audiences what real rock looked and sounded like. No tuxedos, no pretentious concept albums. Just volume, vulnerability, and truth. For Townshend, Elp's rise wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. Because it told young musicians that flash was more important than feeling. And that, to him, was an unforgivable sin. But nothing got under Townshend's skin, quite like the rise of what he called corporate rock. And in that category, there was no bigger target than the Eagles. As their smooth harmonies and laid-back West Coast sound dominated the airwaves, Townshend watched with growing disdain. He saw a band that wasn't challenging the system, but selling out to it, polishing their music until it was safe, sterile, and profitable. He reportedly accused them of making music not from the heart, but from the boardroom. Songs engineered for radio play, lyrics stripped of controversy, melodies tailored to advertising agencies, and the public ate it up. That made it even worse for Townshend, because he wasn't just watching a band climb the charts, he was watching the heart of rock get co-opted and commercialized. He once allegedly said that the Eagles' success proved that rock had stopped being dangerous. And, to him, if rock wasn't dangerous, it wasn't rock at all. He saw in them a kind of betrayal, not just of the music, but of the message. Because where he wanted to scream against the machine, they seemed content to serenade it. Of course, Townshend wasn't only angry at the polished and the pretentious. He also had harsh words for bands that, in his eyes, were faking rebellion. He saw a whole wave of punk rockers rise in the late 70s and early 80s, slashing and burning everything in their path. And while he admired the energy, the anger, even saw a younger version of himself in some of them, there were others he couldn't stand. Bands that he felt wore punk like a costume rather than living it as a truth. He allegedly called some of them cartoon rebels, mocking how quickly their supposed anarchy turned into merchandising and magazine covers. To him, punk wasn't about ripped jeans and sneering at cameras. It was about surviving the dark, fighting the void, pushing against the walls of a world that didn't want you. And any band that didn't earn that the hard way? He dismissed them, harshly. He reportedly told one punk frontman backstage, "You're not angry, you're acting." And the audience deserves better than that. It wasn't about sound. It was about sincerity. And that line, more than anything, defined how Pete Townshend judged a band. But what made Townshend's condemnation sting wasn't just the words. It was the legacy behind them. This was the man who wrote My Generation. Not just a song, but a declaration. A mission statement, a war cry. He wasn't some bitter retiree lobbing insults from the sidelines. He was one of the architects of the rebellion. So when he called out bands for betraying it, whether it was through pompous compositions, corporate, polish, or counterfeit angst, it carried the weight of someone who had bled for this music. His criticisms weren't always fair, and they certainly weren't gentle, but they were rooted in passion, an almost painful love for what rock could be when it was at its most honest, its most defiant, its most alive. And in a world where music has become increasingly about algorithms and aesthetics, Townshend's fire still burns like a warning flare. You can build a career on trends, but only truth, the kind that comes screaming through busted amps and broken strings, can start a revolution, even now at 80. Pete Townshend doesn't care about being politically correct. He doesn't care about making friends in the industry. He's not interested in smiling through interviews or rewriting history. He's here to speak his truth, the same truth that shattered guitars and sold out stadiums. The same truth that made people angry, made them think, made them feel. And maybe, just maybe, that's what rock and roll was always supposed to be. Not polished, not perfect, but powerful and unapologetically real. He reportedly once said that the Eagles were rock music for people who don't actually like rock music. It was a brutal insult, but to Pete Townshend it was simply the truth, a truth he could no longer keep bottled up. What truly infuriated him wasn't just the band's sound, but the direction they were pulling the entire industry. He saw their mellow harmonies, tight production, and glossy image as everything he feared rock would one day become safe, sterile, and engineered, for consumption rather than expression. Townshend allegedly worried that their massive popularity would give record executives the perfect excuse to abandon risk, abandon grit, abandon truth, and replace it all with formulaic songwriting aimed at pleasing the widest audience possible. He watched as the Eagles' music, which he saw as emotionally hollow, was celebrated with awards, critical praise, and commercial success. And every time they climbed higher, he felt rock music sink deeper. According to industry insiders, Townshend would grow visibly agitated when the Eagles won accolades. It wasn't petty jealousy, it was heartbreak. To him, their success wasn't just a triumph of a band. It was a triumph of profit over purpose, of compromise over courage. He believed that their influence was reshaping music into a commodity, polished, pleasant, and entirely devoid of the urgency that once made rock a vehicle for revolution. In his eyes, they didn't just sell records, they sold out the soul of rock and roll. But if the Eagles made his blood boil, Genesis post Peter Gabriel pushed him toward something close to despair. Once upon a time, Genesis had been bold, unpredictable, even bizarre, crafting elaborate, genre-defying albums that demanded attention. But after Gabriel's departure and Phil Collins took the reins, the band shifted course, hard. Their new direction brought them massive commercial success, but to Townshend, it was a betrayal so complete it felt personal. He reportedly viewed the band's transformation as nothing less than an abandonment of everything rock music was meant to stand for. Gone were the avant-garde experimentations, the layered concepts, the sprawling soundscapes. In their place came radio hits, glossy MTV videos, and arena-friendly choruses. He allegedly saw it not as growth, but as surrender. And it wounded him, not just because he respected what they used to be, but because their transformation served as a blueprint for every other progressive rock band wondering how to crack the top 40. What particularly enraged him was the way Genesis became a symbol, a model of how a band could abandon artistic risk for mainstream acceptance and be rewarded beyond their wildest dreams. He reportedly said that watching Genesis rise in the 80s felt like watching your children grow up to become everything you swore you'd never be. That pain bled into interviews where Townshend openly questioned their artistic integrity and mocked their pop direction. In his view, Genesis didn't evolve, they folded. And he feared the industry would now demand the same of every daring, challenging band that once stood a chance of changing the world. Then came a twist that would have shocked anyone expecting solidarity between rebels. At number 2 on Townshend's silent blacklist were the Sex Pistols, the face of British punk, the fire starters of an era. Most would assume Pete admired them. After all, weren't they doing what The Who had done a decade earlier, tearing down the old guard, spitting in the face of authority, rejecting the mainstream? But according to those close to Townshend, nothing could be further from the truth. He reportedly saw the Sex Pistols not as rebels but as frauds, manufactured, manipulated, and molded into controversy by their manager Malcolm McLaren. To Townshend, their brand of rebellion felt artificial, a media stunt rather than a movement. He couldn't stand how their anarchy came wrapped in marketing strategies, how their chaos seemed curated. He believed their shock tactics were designed to sell records, not change the system. And musically he found them laughable. Townshend reportedly dismissed their sound as amateurish at best, claiming they couldn't play their instruments well enough to be taken seriously. He saw their intentionally sloppy performances not as authenticity, but as an insult to musicians who spent years honing their craft. What especially infuriated him was the way the media crowned them as the vanguard of rebellion, as if bands like The Who hadn't been screaming truth to power years before Johnny Rotten ever snarled into a microphone. Townshend allegedly seethed. When critics favorably compared the Pistols to The Who, he saw it as historical erasure, a rewriting of rebellion that favored flashover foundation. In his eyes, the Sex Pistols weren't leaders of a movement, they were imposters, playing dress-up in the ruins of a revolution. And finally, there was Led Zeppelin, the band that most people assumed would be kindred spirits to The Who. Both British, both colossal, both iconic. But behind the scenes, there was no camaraderie, only contempt. Pete Townshend reportedly despised Led Zeppelin with a passion that shocked even those who knew him well. He is said to have once admitted, "I haven't liked a single thing that they've done," and even expressed disgust at being compared to them in any way. What drove that animosity wasn't just style, it was principle. Townshend allegedly saw Zeppelin as a band built on stolen songs, rebranded blues riffs taken from undercredited black artists in America. He believed that their foundation was dishonest, not homage, but exploitation, and that belief colored everything else. Their massive success, in his eyes, wasn't earned through innovation or emotional truth. It was earned through volume, flash, and appropriation. While he was pouring his soul into concept albums that wrestled with philosophy, identity, and society, he saw Zeppelin hammering out blues-based rock that looked backwards instead of forward. Townshend reportedly claimed, that Zeppelin represented everything regressive about rock, a genre stuck in its past, drowning in its own swagger. He was especially disturbed by how their popularity dwarfed that of bands trying to say something new. Every Zeppelin stadium tour felt to him like a celebration of borrowed glory, and the personal rivalry only added fuel to the fire. Townshend allegedly avoided any event where Zeppelin members might appear and made no secret of his disdain during interviews. When people hailed Zeppelin as the greatest rock band of all time, he reportedly bristled, not out of ego, but because he believed they were the least deserving of that title. Their legacy, in his view, was built not on vision or integrity, but on spectacle and theft. And that, to Townshend, was unforgivable. So there you have it, not a list of petty jealousies or musical nitpicks, but a window into the mind of one of rock's most fiercely principled artists. Pete Townshend didn't throw shade lightly. His criticisms weren't random insults. They were laments, mournful declarations from a man who believed rock was more than music. It was a movement, a language for the lost and the furious, and a force for change. And when bands turned that into a business, into a brand, into a product, he saw it as betrayal. Because for Townshend, rock and roll wasn't supposed to make you comfortable. It was supposed to make you feel something, even if that feeling was anger, especially if it was anger.